Okay, so let's talk about passive and active transport. What you can see here is we have our phospholipid bilayer. You see our two layers of phospholipids with our hydrophilic heads that like water and our hydrophobic tails that hate water. So it arranges itself so that the tails are protected from the watery extracellular environment, remember outside the cell, and the watery intracellular environment that's inside the cell. We've also got membrane proteins, which have a very specific shape, like all proteins do, that determines what their job can do. Okay, so the first thing I want you to do, once you've got everything colored in, I want you to look at the key here. So the two here are just oxygen. That's an oxygen molecule. The red, orange, red, and yes, that is orange there in the middle, that would be a carbon dioxide molecule. This is a water molecule. It's made up from one oxygen atom and two hydrogen atoms. And then over here we have potassium, K plus ions, and they're green. And then we have pink sodium ions. Okay, so let's start off. The first thing I want you to do on your diagram, I want you to take a ruler or a sharp pencil, and I want you to draw a line going from a carbon dioxide atom here, going from intracellular to extracellular. Okay, so that tells me that carbon dioxide is going from inside the cell to outside of the cell. And then I want you to take an oxygen molecule, the 2-1, and I want you to draw a line, an arrow coming from the extracellular to the intracellular. So these two arrows are going in opposite directions, which makes perfect sense when you think about it, because we know that cells do cellular respiration. We know that cellular respiration happens inside the cell, intracellular, and we know in cellular respiration that cells they use oxygen because it's a reactant of cellular respiration, so it's going to need to come into the cell. And we know that cellular respiration produces carbon dioxide, so that's a product, which is a waste product, which is going to need to leave the cell. So it's going to go from inside the cell to outside the cell. Okay, coming over here, I drew another arrow that goes from a water molecule. It goes from okay, start again. You know what happens when you sit in the room too long without moving around, the lights go off. You know that water molecules go from outside the cell to inside the cell, or vice versa. They can in fact go from inside to outside, but in this case I've got the water molecules moving from extracellular to intracellular. So it's going inside the cell and it's going through the channel in the middle of this channel protein. And then over here, you've already got the arrows drawn. We'll come to that one in a minute. So let's start. Step number 1, all right, when you're going to work out what's going on, is to count molecules. So my first step here is I'm going to count the number of oxygen molecules that are outside the cell. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And I'm going to write the number 7 there, okay? And then I'm going to count oxygen molecules that are inside the cell. And you can count here, I've got 1, 2. So I'm going to write 2 there. Okay? Now, look at the arrow. It's going from the high number to the low number. We're going from where there's more oxygen to where there's less oxygen. And that, if you remember from when we did our concentration gradient, okay, we'll see this over here. When we go from a high number to a low number, we are going with the concentration gradient. And when we go downhill, it's passive. Remember, that means it does not require energy, right? Remember my story about being on the sled, okay? So oxygen moves from a high number to a low number. Oxygen is moving with the concentration gradient. It's going downhill. It is passive, okay? So this type of transport does not require energy. Now, let me do the same thing with the carbon dioxide. So I'm going to count the carbon dioxide on this side. I have 1, 2. That's it. So I'm going to write number 2 there. Come down here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 there. And look at the direction of the arrow. I'm going from where there's more, number 7, to where there's less, number 2. I'm going from a high concentration to a low concentration. So even though carbon dioxide is moving in the opposite direction, it's going from the big number to the small number. So it also is going with the concentration gradient. It's going downhill from the high to the low, from where there's more of it to where there's less of it. Okay? So that is also passive. So what that type of transport, we got that out of the way, that type of transport, when we go with the concentration gradient, is called simple diffusion. Okay, so I'm going to write right here, I'm going to write simple diffusion. Okay, simple diffusion is where we go from high to low, and it is passive. So down here, where my key is on these two, I'm going to write passive, and this is how simple molecules like oxygen, carbon dioxide get in and out of the cell. Okay, passive, so that's no energy because we're going downhill. All right, now let's look at how water gets in, because water is similar but not exactly the same. Again, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to start by counting molecules. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Down here, 1, 2, 3. Okay, look at the direction of the arrow. I'm going from where I've got more, a bigger number, to where I've got a smaller number. I'm going from a high number to a low number. I'm still going downhill, right? I am still going with the concentration gradient, okay? And that's how water moves. Water moves from high to low, where there's more water to where there's less water. But here's the difference. You remember we talked about how the phospholipid bilayers have the hydrophilic heads and the hydrophobic tails? If water molecules just tried to get straight through, like carbon dioxide and oxygen do, they'd get a problem when they got to the tail region, because the tails hate water, so they repel it. So water molecules can't just go through the phospholipid bilayer. They need to be helped through. And so we have proteins that will allow water molecules to pass through without ever having to get tangled up in the tails. And because they're helped through, even though, remember, it's still going from where there's more to where there's less, because it's helped, there is a word. When you help someone, you facilitate, right? So facilitated diffusion, because we're still going from high to low, because we're going with the concentration gradient. So again, what I'm going to write down here is this is still passive, right? Because it doesn't require energy. I'm going to give you a couple more words here. Yeah, this is a doozy. All right, this one here, this type of protein molecule, it is a channel protein. We talked about that when we talked about the structure of the cell membrane. But it's also got a special name because this one specifically is used for letting water get through. And because it's specific to water, it is called an aqua, which we know means water, porin. Think about a pore is like a little channel, right? An aqua porin. That is the name of this type of channel protein because it allows water to get through. And again, water is still going from where there's more of it to where there's low of it. Okay, I'm also going to throw one other word in here. Facilitated, there are lots of different proteins that allow lots of different things through the cell membrane. They help them get through because they can't just go through the phospholipid bilayer. When you are talking about water, sorry, I didn't need to bang on the table. When you are talking about water, right, and water only, right, so the transport of water, right, this is called osmosis, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more about osmosis later, but that is the transport. This is H2O and H2O only. Okay. All right. That is osmosis. Now, facilitated diffusion. Now, let's look over here because the way I've drawn this, it looks like there are two proteins, but this is one protein and it can change shape. So again, we start off with exactly the same thing we started with these two. Let's look at the sodium ions. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I've got 12 on this side, and I've got 1, 2, 3 on this side, right? And you will notice by the look at the arrow, right? The arrow is going from 3 to 12. So, unlike oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water, when you're talking about sodium, we are going from the low number to the high number. We are going from low to high. We are going against the concentration gradient. And if you remember my story about sledding and my coccyx, you will know that when you go uphill, it takes a lot of work. It is a very active process and it requires a great deal of energy. And the energy that cells use to move sodium ions from where there's less of it to where there's more of it, go from less to more, they use this form of energy called ATP, which you can see here in the diagram too. Now, let's look at the potassium ions because they are going into the cell. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 potassium ions on this side, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 on this side. So again, when you look at the direction of the arrows, potassium is going from where there's less of it to where there's more of it. Potassium is going uphill. It's going against the concentration gradient, right? Which means it also is going to require energy. Okay, so, and this whole thing here is called a sodium-potassium pump, and we're going to do a little bit more on that here in a little bit. But what it's telling you is that we are moving sodium ions out of the cell from intracellular to extracellular. We're moving sodium ions out of the cell against their concentration gradient. We go from 3 to 12. And we are moving potassium ions into the cell against their concentration gradient. We're going from 4 to 12, right? That requires a great deal of energy. So we are going, and we're talking about this type of transport where we're moving things in and out of the cell against their concentration gradient. This is called active transport. Okay, and the example that I have provided here is called the sodium potassium pump. And we are moving things from low concentration to high concentration. We're moving things against their concentration gradient. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to write active. Okay? Now, I want to give you, apart from writing the numbers down, and I do this when you have a test question, right? Count the things on each side of the cell membrane. But I also want you to notice something. This protein is changing shape. And you see this thing here, ATP? That tells you 100% that this is an active process and you're moving things from low concentration to high concentration. Okay? All right, so that's active and passive transport. I just want to recap a couple of things. First, count the molecules on each side of the cell membrane. Second, look at the direction of the arrows, right? If they're going from a big number to a small number, you know it's passive. It's going with the concentration gradient. If you know it's going from a small number to a big number, it is going against the concentration gradient and it is going to require energy in the form of ATP. All right. Make sure that you fill in your arrows, your numbers, and the little notes underneath.